It was 2 a.m., and the thermometer attached to the frosted window of Mike Anderson's cabin read minus 45 degrees in the midst of a storm. What seemed like one of the harshest winters of his life was about to intensify even further. Having lived in this remote part of Alaska for 5 years, Mike had never experienced conditions this extreme. Each winter had seemed crueler than the last, but this time, nature seemed ready to test him to his deepest limits. Alaska in its vastness is unforgiving for those who believe they can tame it. The vast white expanses and the solitude of the mountains had become Mike's everyday life, having left his fast-paced life in Seattle to immerse himself in nature, far from everything. His small wooden cabin, isolated from the noises of the world, was his refuge. But on this February day, an extraordinary storm was approaching, and everything he had learned to survive in these harsh lands was about to be put to the test. He had always had a strict routine, checking food supplies, maintaining the generator, monitoring the weather. Everything had to be perfect. A small deviation could be fatal. That morning, he had breakfast in peace, the crackling fire in the fireplace warming the room. However, the weather forecast was far from reassuring. A low-pressure system was approaching from the north, promising record-low temperatures and winds strong enough to uproot trees. This was no longer just a storm, it was a test. But Mike wasn't the type to panic. He had lived in isolation, learning to listen to nature's whispers. And that day, nature was whispering ominous signs. Everything seemed to be accelerating. By the afternoon, snow was falling in thick curtains, reducing visibility to just a few meters. The gusts were sweeping everything in their path. The wind howled so loudly against the windows that they seemed on the verge of giving way under the pressure. Mike sprang into action, reinforcing the security of his equipment and checking the integrity of his supplies. He felt oddly calm, knowing everything was under control. But something unexpected happened. At midnight, as the storm raged on, Mike heard a noise, a dull sound, a growl, unlike anything he had ever heard in these woods. It came from outside, and the sound was both strange and unsettling, almost like a call. He approached the window, flashlight in hand, trying to make sense of what was happening outside. The snow swirled so densely that he couldn't make anything out at first, but his eyes adjusted to the flickering light of the flashlight. There, in the freezing cold, he saw 3 dark shapes. They moved slowly, their heavy steps sinking into the snow. A mother bear, exhausted, was struggling to move forward, followed by her 2 cubs. Mike went pale. These creatures, normally hibernating at this time of year, were up in the middle of a storm. The sight was even more shocking because the mother, usually large and powerful, seemed terribly weakened. The cubs, trembling, huddled against her, desperately seeking warmth in the icy air. The thermometer read minus 45 degrees, but the wind chill made the temperature even more brutal. Mike knew that bears usually hibernated during this time. Their appearance in the midst of the storm was a sign of extreme distress. Perhaps their den had been destroyed? Or was this a final instinctive surge to survive the impossible? There was no doubt this scene was a desperate call for help. Mike's survival instinct urged him to stay inside. The safety rules were clear: never approach a bear, especially in winter, and even less so a mother with her cubs. Bears in distress could become unpredictable and dangerous. But an inner voice screamed at him not to just stand there and watch. The image of the mother, lost, trembling, and her helpless cubs tormented his mind. The hours passed slowly. Inside, Mike couldn't take his eyes off the fragile silhouette struggling outside. The storm was becoming more violent, but his humanity couldn't turn its back on this sight. It was a decision that would test his deepest values. He thought of his father's words, who had often said to him, "Nature does not forgive negligence, but it rewards courage." Mike felt torn between safety and altruism. The wind battered the cabin, and the air inside felt icy despite the fire crackling in the fireplace. Mike turned toward his storage shed, the small building he had designed to store his equipment. It was isolated and could offer temporary shelter. But how could he get the bears inside without causing a panic that might destroy everything? There was only one way to find out. Courage prevailed. He rushed to the shed. There, he set up portable heaters and placed blankets on the floor. Then, he took some supplies, a bit of dry food, hoping it would be enough to convince the mother bear to enter the shelter. His heart raced. He knew this operation would be dangerous, but he had no choice. He opened the cabin door. A freezing gust hit him, and the outside air took his breath away. But he moved forward. A few meters ahead, the bears struggled to stay on their feet, their breath short, their bodies trembling. The mother bear looked up, her exhausted eyes filled with gratitude. She knew he was their last hope. Speaking softly, Mike approached cautiously. He laid a blanket over the cubs, then gently over the mother. She didn't move. Her strength seemed entirely devoted to protecting her young. The seconds stretched on. Every movement was measured, every gesture crucial. He felt a strange connection, a moment suspended between two worlds, that of man and nature. After doing all he could, he slowly backed away, the door slamming against the wind. His eyes never left the mother, who, with a destabilizing strength, urged her cubs to move, to slip through the small door of the shed. It was a fight for survival, but they were almost there. Finally, after a long and arduous journey, the mother entered the shelter with her cubs, collapsing from exhaustion inside, a final glimmer of determination in her eyes before she surrendered to sleep. Mike gently closed the door. The storm still raged, shaking the cabin, but an unusual peace filled Mike. He had defied nature, and for once, he had won. He watched through the window as the mother warmed her cubs with her own body. They had survived, for that night at least. The storm subsided with the first light of dawn. Mike was no longer alone. What had started as a survival test had turned into a lesson in solidarity and humility. In the dark hours that followed, he reflected on what he had done. It was much more than just a rescue operation. It was an act of faith in nature and in humanity. The bears were no longer just creatures to photograph. They were now a living memory, a story shared between him and nature, one that no photo could capture. It was a sacred bond that between man and animal, the fragile balance between life and survival.